Well, hello and welcome to another Lanzarote information video. I'm Mike from Lanzarote Information. Now, I've had a lot of really good feedback, so thank you. I really appreciate that on the stories I've been doing about the history of various places in Lanzarote. And this one we're doing today is one which delves back into the really ancient history of the island before the Spanish conquest. And I'm doing this one at request of one of our viewers. We're going to be talking about the Mahos, who were the indigenous or aboriginal people of the island before the conquest. They're also known, if you take the whole of the Canary Islands, as the Guanches. But Mahos particularly refers to the ones who were living in Lanzarote and Fuerteventura, so the two easternmost islands, and they called themselves Mahos. What the Spanish didn't know and got a bit mixed up about was whether it was Maho with an H in the middle or Maho with a J in the middle, and I've seen it spelt both ways. Now, obviously, we only really have decent records about them from the time of the Spanish conquest, but research and archaeology has given us a lot of clues about their origin, who they were, how they lived in the period before the conquest. So the early part of it is all based on those kind of archaeological works and DNA testing on stuff that has been found on them, from them. Now, as a result of that historical work, the best guesses are that the first people to arrive in the Canary Islands were Berber tribesmen who were brought over from North Africa by the Phoenicians. And they arrived about 10 centuries before Christ. And we further learn that about 400 years later, so the 6th century before Christ, people from the Kingdom of Carthage also came to the islands and supplemented the populations that were living on them in that period. And we know for sure that the Romans were here, and they were here in the period of about 400 before Christ initially. And they set up a factory, for example, in Los Lobos, which is the little island that exists between Lanzarote and Fuerteventura. And they made purple dye from there, which was extremely valuable to the Roman Empire. And there are some suggestions that the Romans used the Canary Islands as a kind of tourist destination in the way that we do today. They described them, they called them the Fortunate Islands. Fortunate because the weather was so temperate. And they would come here in the summer, perhaps to get away from the very, very hot Roman summers, but more importantly during the winter months to get away from the cold and the rain of Northern Europe in winter. So by the time the Roman Empire imploded in on itself in around 400 AD, we had a situation where the Canary Islands that had started with a population of Berbers and then added Carthaginians into the mix and then presumably some Romans into the mix. It had a kind of stable population. And with the end of the Roman Empire and before the rise through the Middle Ages of all the other travellers from around the world took place, the islands became very isolated, and that population just grew and kind of looked after itself. Now, the Mahos, the Guanches, were quite adept at doing this, and they were described by the first settlers after the conquest by Spain as being unusually tall people, very strong people, often with blue eyes, which was quite unusual in this part of the world at that time. And they lived peaceably. They were basically farmers. They farmed goats and sheep. They grew barley, from which they made gofio, which is a kind of flour-like product, which is still used today in the islands. They dressed themselves in animal skins, and they lived in what they called deep houses, and these were houses dug into the ground to provide the walls for the houses with a roof protruding over the top. And in Lanzarote they were generally made using a sort of using local stones that had come from ancient volcanoes and creating a lime render that they would render around the walls. And houses were still being built in that same basic way, although not sunk into the ground, right up until the late 18th and early 19th century. They got their food by fishing as well. So the combination of farming animals, fishing, they would catch birds as well that were on migratory routes. They managed to live very well and very comfortably on the islands during that period. Their biggest issue would have been water, and they became adept at creating wells, aljibes, that we still use here today, to gather rainwater coming down from the hills and to store it through the dry months of the summer. Now, in terms of the societal setup, there were only about 200 people living on Lanzarote at the time of the Spanish conquest in 1402. And they had kings, and these were hereditary kings, so it went through from the family to the oldest son. And apart from the king who obviously ruled the island and dealt with disputes and controlled the army of warriors that they had to defend the island from pirates, they were then organised into family groups in different parts of the island, with a head of each family group, usually the oldest male. Now, the rest of the world discovering how to smelt iron and how to create metal tools completely bypassed the Canary Islands. So they didn't have access to metal at all at the time the Spanish arrived here. They would make their weapons out of flint and hard stone. They'd make spears out of pieces of wood, and they used slings and arrows very effectively as well. They hadn't discovered how to turn clay to make pots and crockery and all the kind of stuff that we eat off, but they had learned to use it for that. They just hadn't established the use of a wheel to make them smooth and nice. So they were pretty rough and random, and lots of bits and pieces of them had been found where they'd been kind of worked by hand into the rough shape of a plate. In terms of religion, it's understood that they did believe there was a superior being, but it seems that different parts of the island, different families of the island had a different view. Some felt that the superior being was the sun. Others on other islands, for example in Teide, they worshipped in Tenerife I should say, they worshipped the Mount Teide as a god. But in addition to that, they had a number of idols as well. And there are cave drawings on this island and other islands which suggest that they were carrying out worship to these other gods and idols as well. Now, women had what's called polyandry here in Lanzarote, and each woman on the island was able to have 3 husbands to share her bed with. Now, I mentioned the kings at the beginning. The 3 most famous kings, and the ones that the Spanish conquistadores found out about when they arrived on the island, and these are names you'll probably recognize because they're used as street names and place names on the island currently. The first of those was Sonsamas, who was a king of Lanzarote from 1377. The second was Guanches, who was king from 1393. And the king at the time the Spanish arrived here in 1402 was Guadarfia. So these are all names you see, and they've continued to this day. So what happened to them when the Spanish arrived? Well, it's quite an interesting story relating to Lanzarote, because the expedition that came from Spain to conquer the islands was led by Jean de Betancourt. And he arrived initially on the island of La Graciosa and eventually went across to Lanzarote. And he had brought with him a troop of very well equipped Spanish soldiers mainly from Andalusia. And they were expecting a fight, and they didn't get one because Guadafia, the king, came to them, spoke to them, and the Lanzaroteños, the Mahos, as they were called at that time, had real problems over the years with pirates coming to the island and taking their women and stealing their food and their goats and just sort of raping and pillaging as pirates did in those days. So instead of fighting off Jean de Betancourt and his men, the king asked them if they could be taken under the protection of the Spanish government, the Spanish king, and Jean de Betancourt readily agreed to that and basically took control of Lanzarote without a fight. Eventually the same happened in Fuerteventura, but it was to be another 100 years before the islands of Gran Canaria and Tenerife were taken, because the Guanches in those islands wanted to fight, and there were some really, really big battles between the Guanches and the Spanish over possession of those western islands. But coming back to Lanzarote, there was a reasonable sort of coalition basically between the new Spanish arrivals and Guadafia and his people, and it kind of worked reasonably well, to the extent that several of the senior Spanish officers ended up marrying Maho women, for example Princesa Tequise, and therefore a lot of the people who live in Lanzarote now can trace their lineage back all the way to those original Maho people on one side or the other of their family. So unlike in a lot of places that were captured and conquered in the Middle Ages, where the indigenous population was pretty much wiped out, that didn't happen here in Lanzarote, and the indigenous population merged with the new incoming population from Spain and became Canarians, as they are today. So there you go, that's the story of the Mahos as much as we know of it anyway, and for sure I know that the people of Lanzarote now, who can trace their lineage back to the original Aborigines of the island, are very proud of that fact, and they'll tell you that they descend from Guanche or Maho stock if they get a chance to do so. Hope you found that interesting and useful, and thank you so much once again for watching. If you've got any questions about this or anything relating to Lanzarote, just stick a comment in below. I read every single comment and I will always endeavour to answer your questions. Bye for now everyone, bye.